Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Well, good morning, everyone. Looking at another glitch this weekend, and that's loneliness. When you're lonely, one of the best things you can do is meet other people. Psychologists have said this and known this for a really long time. But I understand that it can be a challenge to meet other people, so I thought I would come up with a few icebreakers that you could try. So if you're out in a crowd, try this. I threw a boomerang a few years ago. I now live in constant fear. My friend took me to what he said was an escape room. Turns out he just locked me in the closet. What did the duck say when she bought lipstick and put it on my bill? I've been getting into astronomy, so I installed a skylight. The people who live above me are furious. And last but not least, a bank is a place that will lend you money if you can prove that you don't need it. That last one from the one and only Bob Hope. Those are all from pretty famous comedians. But being alone is pretty serious, and it's really hard for us to do. The great Henry Nouwen said, "Nobody escapes being wounded. We all are wounded people, whether physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. The main question is not how can we hide our wounds so we don't have to be embarrassed, but how can we put our woundedness in the service of others? When our wounds cease to be a source of shame and become a source of healing, we have become wounded healers. Jesus is God's wounded healer, and through his wounds we are healed. Jesus' suffering and death brought joy and life. His humiliation brought glory. His rejection brought a community of love. And as followers of Jesus, we can also allow our wounds to bring healing to others. No man can stay alive when nobody is waiting for him. Everyone who returns from a long and difficult trip is looking for someone waiting for him or her at the station or the airport. Everyone wants to tell his or her story and share their moments of pain and exhilaration with someone who stayed home waiting for him or her to come back. Henry Nouwen. One study found that the cost of loneliness in the U.S. among Americans aged 65 or older cost the government nearly $7 billion in additional healthcare costs per year. That's a lot of money. A neuroscience researcher named John Cacioppo of the University of Chicago spent nearly 3 decades exploring the social nature of the human brain and working to find the mechanisms behind traits such as loneliness. He learned that loneliness is a mechanism that's in place because we need, as social species, people, to be able to identify when our connections with others for mutual aid and protection are being threatened or are absent. If there's no connection, there could be mortal consequences for us as humans. So when you feel lonely, you get more defensive. You focus more on self-preservation, even though this is not done intentionally. Completely unbeknownst to you, your brain is focusing more on self-preservation than the preservation of those around you. That then in turn can make you less pleasant to be around. And over time, this can increase the likelihood of negative social interactions and even more loneliness. So the focus on self-preservation can have short-term survival benefits, but if it's not reversed, it can have long-term costs. Long-term feelings of loneliness can affect your health in a lot of ways. For example, chronic loneliness can drive up cortisol levels in your body. That's the hormone that your body creates when under stress. And over time, the higher cortisol levels can lead to inflammation, excess weight gain, insulin resistance, problems concentrating, and more. And if left unchecked, this chronic loneliness and the symptoms of it can put you at a greater risk for really serious medical and emotional problems, including depression, sleep disorders, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, mental health and emotional problems, and a lot more. It's a pretty serious situation. It helps to know that the Hebrew word for lonely is from the root word meaning bad. And the concrete meaning behind that is separation. So a part of the body or a branch of a tree or a bar that carries something. And in the figurative sense, the chief of a city or a leader, which makes a lot of sense. What can we do about this, and how can we overcome loneliness? This psalm, along with numerous other passages, tells us that God is always with us, always loving us, always caring for us. But how do we see that? Brene Brown says in her book called Braving the Wilderness, when we hear someone else sing about the jagged edges of heartache or the unspeakable nature of grief, we immediately know we're not the only ones in pain. In our sharing, we say to one another, "You're not alone." But she goes on to say that the world feels highly lonesome and heartbroken to me right now. We've sorted ourselves into factions based on our politics and ideology. We've turned away from one another and toward blame and rage. We're lonely and untethered. And I think she's right. The famous Thomas Long told a story about Jack Casey, who was a paramedic and ambulance driver. And when this kid was a child, he had to have dental surgery that required anesthesia, and he was terrified. So a nurse said to him, "Casey, don't worry. I'll be right beside you no matter what happens." And she was true to her word. When he woke up, she was there, and everything was okay. Years later, as a paramedic and an ambulance driver, Casey was called to the scene of a really bad traffic accident. The driver was pinned upside down beneath his pickup truck, terrified and crying out that he was afraid of dying. Casey crawled inside the cab of the truck to reach him, even though gasoline was dripping down on both of them. Rescue workers were beginning to use the power tools, jaws of life, to cut the metal. One spark could have produced a catastrophe. Jack crawled inside beside the man, said, "Look, don't worry. I'm right here with you. I'm not going anywhere." Exactly what the nurse had told him years before. When it was all over and the man had recovered, he said to Casey, "You were really not that smart. That thing could have exploded and we both would have been burned up." Jack said, "You know what? I felt I just couldn't leave you alone." Jesus said, "I will not leave you orphaned." He said, "I will not leave you orphaned." That is a promise from Jesus himself. Regardless of the circumstances of our lives, storm, death, separation, we have never been and will never be orphaned by God. This psalm says that. I will not leave you orphaned. Over and over, day after day, regardless of what is happening in our lives, that is Jesus' promise. We have not been abandoned. So we should not abandon ourselves to any of the orphanages that this world creates. I shared this story before, but Fred Craddock once preached about an experience he had when he went back to Gatlinburg, Tennessee, where he grew up. And he and his wife, Nettie, went to take a little short vacation. While they were there, they stopped into a new restaurant called the Black Bear Inn, where they could have a meal while looking out at the Great Smoky Mountains. And while they were there waiting for their food, they noticed a distinguished-looking gentleman making his way around the room, telling stories and greeting people, everybody in sight, glad-handing all of them, acting like he really kind of owned the place. And Fred whispered to his wife, "I hope he doesn't come over here," which is, of course, exactly what the man did. And he said, "Are you on vacation?" And Fred said yes. And kind of under his breath, he was saying, "It's really none of your business." The man said, "Where are you from?" And Fred said, "Oklahoma." And he said, "Well, what do you do there?" Fred said, "I teach homiletics at a graduate school," hoping that the response would either be confusing or would just send this man away. But the man said, and he smiled. "So you teach preachers? Well, I've got a story to tell you." And with that, he pulled up a chair and sat down at the table. Now, Fred groaned inwardly because he knew this wasn't going to be a fast situation. The man said, "I was born not far from here, just across the mountain in eastern Tennessee. My mother was not married when I was born, and the whole community knew it. So I had a hard time. When I started school, my classmates had a name for me, and it was not a nice name. I used to go off by myself at recess and eat lunch alone. When I went into town with my mother, I would see people staring at me, trying to guess who my father was. In my early teens, I began to attend a little church back in the mountains called Laurel Springs Christian Church. It had a minister who was a great preacher, and for whatever reason, his sermons did something for me and to me. But I was always afraid that I would not be welcome since I did not know my father. People did not know to whom I belonged, and it bothered them. It bothered me. So I would just go from time to time to hear the sermon and leave before anyone had a chance to talk to me. I was so afraid someone would stop me and say, "What's a boy like you doing in a church?" Well, one Sunday, the benediction was over too quickly. And he said, I did not have a chance to escape. And before I could make my way to the door, I felt this large, heavy hand on my shoulder. And it was the preacher. He said, I trembled in fear. He looked right in my eyes and said, "Son, who do you belong to?" I didn't respond because I could tell he too, like all the others, was going to take a guess as to who my father was. But a moment later, the preacher said, "Now, just wait a minute. I see the family resemblance. Son, you belong to God. It is a striking resemblance. You are a child of God. I can see it so clearly in your face. Now you get out there and claim your inheritance." And he slapped him on the back. The elderly gentleman paused, and Fred and Nettie realized they were holding their breath. And he started up again, and he said, "I left that church a different person. It was the single most important sentence I had ever heard. It changed my life after all those years of not knowing, all those years of wondering, all those years of stares. He told me who I truly was." And Fred said he finally found his words and asked the man, "What is your name?" The man said, "Ben Hooper." And it was then that Fred realized that they had been talking to the person that the people of Tennessee had twice elected as their governor. Fred Craddock told that story. And a man who realized in his church who he truly was, a branch on the vine, a baby in the womb, surrounded by the presence of love of God, given life and identity. God is always in our lonely places. Remember Jacob, who declared, "God, you were in this place, but I never knew it." If you and I can care to help and heal our neighbors, we will see our own help and healing too. And I pray that we can be that church that loves and cares and is loved and cared for. Thanks be to God. Amen.